All right. Thanks for your patience, everybody. GraphQL Conf, this is amazing. All the speakers on the stage so far have just been just totally blown away. So thanks to you all for coming. GraphQL is a superpower for your product manager and your designer. I want to focus in on that word superpower for a minute. Think about like a famous superpower origin story that you know of, maybe in like pop culture, comic books, movies. And go ahead and don't be shy, shout it out. I'll start. Spider bite. What's another origin story that you're aware of? Batman. Okay, so we have Batman, superpower origin stories. Anybody else? Iron Man. Okay, so like, and what about the superpowers? Like, for example, I think of the Hulk, right? And like radiation exposure, right? Or lab accidents and things like that. This is starting out pretty gruesome, actually, but the common thread that I see in a lot of like superpower origin story tropes is like, they're all circumstantial. They happen to somebody rather than necessarily because of them. And that's kind of how I think about what happens when an engineering team adopts GraphQL. As a result of that, product managers and designers that we work with actually get new abilities, new ways of working, and that can elevate the performance of the entire team. That's what I want to talk to you about today. Hi, I'm Jeff Auriemma. My pronouns are he and him. I live in Connecticut, and I am an engineering manager at Apollo, and the team that I serve makes Apollo Client, Apollo iOS, and Apollo Kotlin. No superpowers, unfortunately, but I do enjoy baking. I do enjoy a nice hike with my family, and when I run out of energy, I make a fancy coffee, and then I'm back at it. I would like to invite your critical feedback on this talk, too. I'm sure a lot of folks in this room have spent a lot of time thinking about how GraphQL impacts teams, right? And please do come find me. Tell me what resonated with you, what could use some work, or if you don't get a chance to see me later on, let's connect on social media at the handles that you see there. This is one of my proudest projects. It involves two of my passions, GraphQL and baking. I made some French macarons for my team that were branded, Apollo branded and GraphQL branded, and that was a lot of fun. I really like GraphQL is what I'm trying to say. I first started using it about 5 years ago when my second child was just born. I was on bedtime duty, and everybody was asleep, mercifully. And I had my laptop open. I was scrolling Hacker News or Twitter, I forget, and I found a tutorial. And I learned how to set up a GraphQL app using GraphQL. Corinne and I were just talking about GraphQL earlier. Bring back GraphQL. That was a lot of fun. And Apollo Client. And I was just hooked. I saw the future immediately. It was just so much joy in that moment as a developer. And I want that feeling to happen to as many people as possible, and not just folks who are developers and software engineers. So here's what I hope you'll take away from this talk. First, I'll cover some common themes that I've noticed in the way that engineers discuss GraphQL and the gaps that I see. From there, as the title of the talk implies, I'll talk about our non-engineering colleagues. There is no I in GraphQL after all. And then I'll cover some concrete examples that illustrate the point in more detail. And I hope all of that builds to the outcome of all of you, the folks in this room, having a few more ways to talk about GraphQL to a broader audience. GraphQL isn't for everyone or every team, but since this is a GraphQL Conf, I'm assuming that at least most of us like GraphQL and want to see it thrive. And part of the way we do that is through adoption. So let's talk about the stuff that we all know is good. I'll let this kind of animation play out, this totally real conversation between engineer friend and GraphQL fan. And these are some common threads that we might see folks talking about. And I'll freeze frame here because it's always, there we go, yeah. So freeze frame here. Folks talk about the type system, right? The dev tooling. They talk about the community. These are all great. And GraphQL also shines at scale. These are all things to write home about, things that engineers get passionate about. And though GraphQL is a transformational technology, it's not without trade-offs, right? Most will say it's worth it. Some will say it's not. Here, GraphQL Skeptic is talking through a few pain points that I see people sharing in public about GraphQL. And I'm going to go ahead and freeze frame here. But regardless of, like, honestly, I have a few pet peeves with things like this because I think they're about solvable or solved problems. But regardless, they reflect people's authentic experiences, right? The things that they've lived through or the things that they perceive. And that's real. That's something to talk about, right? They're sincerely held. And ultimately, it boils down to trade-offs. Engineers considering adopting GraphQL will think about what problems it solves for them. they'll also think about what problems they think it will create for them, whether real or imagined. Which means that GraphQL has a bit of a problem. But I'm a manager, we thrive on euphemisms, so instead I'll say that we have an opportunity. We run into some limitations talking about GraphQL, because when the discourse about GraphQL is of engineers, by engineers, and for engineers, 2 plus 2 can really only equal 4, right? It's going to be sort of a hard-nosed trade-off between, kind of all the benefits that we see, all the potential drawbacks we see, and then we go ahead and compute, and it's either going to be a yes or a no. But we can make 2 plus 2 equal more than that. 500 if you want. If you want to widen the frame and talk about GraphQL in a way that isn't so transactional and focuses on the benefits of the entire team, which are significant. Because GraphQL is more than just the sum of its features and trade-offs for the folks implementing it. GraphQL can be the basis for a better operating model for modern teams across functions. I'll frame that just a bit more here. We don't work alone, right? We work with folks who aren't software engineers. Product managers and designers are the folks I'm picking out today. But you might think about somebody from sales on your team, somebody from support. And the reason why I want to talk about them is because GraphQL is one of those special technologies, the impact of which can be felt outside engineering in a tangible way. It's not just an implementation detail. It's real. It addresses real needs of the folks who work with us. So now I'll walk through kind of a very generalized view of how teams evolve over time, because GraphQL's impact changes, or at least what you feel changes over an organization's life cycle, right? The things you zoom in on. Most orgs start out being able to build fast. It's greenfield programming, right? Your understanding of the market and users, though, will take time to build. But usually when you're thinking about your tech stack at this time, you're thinking about how quickly ideas get off your fingertips and onto the screen or into production, right? And GraphQL has a great story to tell there. There's great dev tooling, and there's no real problem here, but as the team grows, let's say you manage to get a foothold, one outcome, you're growing, right? And there might be an inflection point where you run into the bottleneck where you have to, continue shipping new features, but also your users are relying on certain things all of a sudden. You have to keep a stable and secure experience for them. This is where GraphQL's benefits become a little more real, a little more broad, not just in terms of dev tooling, but the way that you operate. You'll start building a team of product managers and designers at some point. And the engineers start to learn the cost of being scrappy and hire not just for feature development, but for maintenance and security as well. This increased specialization increases your communication overhead. And yesterday and also on the internet, you heard Theo talking about some of the communication problems that GraphQL solves. But we can go even beyond that. There's this magic moment, right, where the team starts to have more ideas about what to build than it has the means to build them. Your understanding of your users in your market gets mature, and you also have to worry about covering what you already have. It's this constant imbalance, this asymmetry between building things, fixing things, maintaining things. And that can be a bit of a struggle. It can cause friction. And that can be especially true when the engineers have one boss, right? The PM has another, the designer has yet another, and so forth. A team of 10 could report up to 3 or 4 different management chains in a product organization. And even in a healthy organization with everybody acting in good faith, there's a bit of hazard there. A single team reporting to multiple bosses could lead to valuable ideas, worthy trade-offs, a great balance of priorities, and it can also lead to competing incentives. I mean, I've seen the same team being asked variations of this question all the time, right? And how do you prioritize them? How do you tell one person that this has to wait while the other person, yeah, we're going to move on this? Again, all of the trade-offs that these questions imply can be the source of friction, which can lead to stress. We don't do our best work under stress as a team, right? Now, GraphQL won't get rid of the stress in your life. It can't solve all those problems, but it can eliminate some of the practical obstacles that get in the way of building faster. So your team can go ahead and get to the next stage of that life cycle. I'm going to take some time now to walk through kind of a plausible example. This is definitely in the realm of the genre of realistic fiction. And I'm going to talk about a team that's working on a music streaming app. All right, so I'll go ahead and walk through this, and bear with me, I'm still getting my, I'm trying to look at this monitor while I do it, but I'm going to go ahead and walk us through, this is like a Spotify clone that's made with the Apollo stack here. I actually made us a playlist too, if you want to see, GraphQL Conf 2023. And it's got all these GraphQL words in it. But this clone, the Spotify clone, has all the different things you might expect. of a music app, right, you can drill down into artists, into songs, into albums, and so forth, right? And in case you're wondering what's going on under the hood, if you go to Apollo GraphQL/Spotify showcase on GitHub, you can kind of play around with this. It's using Apollo Client 3.8 with suspense support under the hood, as well as Apollo Server and Apollo Router, and it's powered by the Spotify API that we wrapped as a data source into a GraphQL backend. Shout out to Jerome Miller, who did a lot of the early work in getting this up and running, as well as many of the other contributors that have made this a reality. More on that, I'll click back through that in a little bit, but I just wanted to set the scenario for everybody. Okay, so in a traditional sort of app structure, let's forget GraphQL for just a second. In a traditional sort of API structure, right, where resources are accessed by making requests to different routes, you might, fetch a song like this, right? Make a GET request, you go ahead and get the song back. Some folks call this a REST or RESTful architecture. I prefer to use the term like resource-based, only because I think REST has strayed a little far from its original meaning. Regardless, this is how a song might be represented and accessed, right? And same with an artist, an album, and my favorite playlist. Of course, the songs endpoint doesn't just have flat data about songs, right? This is a GraphQL conference. This is like a classic GraphQL, picture of what problems GraphQL solves, right? If you're fetching a song, you still need data about the album and the artist in order to paint it on the screen, right? And so that gives you a choice as an API designer right away, right? Do you just give the front end an ID, and then they have to go ahead and fetch the album and the artist in order to complete the UI and give them that complexity? Or do you go ahead and, on the back end, eager load everything and maybe slow down your latency numbers? Classic conundrum. We all know how GraphQL kind of solves that problem for engineers, right? But it's actually a really big problem for product managers, too, because coupling data shape to UI structure is a problem. It's not just a problem for API design. It's a problem for, say, an A/B test, right? Or just rapid iteration. But I'm going to focus on the A/B test here. It's a common scenario. This is my talk. I get to make the rules, so I'm going to stipulate something here. Let's stipulate that our product manager on our music streaming app thinks that making a change in the playlist view will lift our team's KPIs. Everybody's favorite letters, KPIs. That change involves, we'll say, in this fictional scenario, adding a new column of data to the playlist view, and I'll click through it for in a second to illustrate this. And let's say further that new column needs data that's not currently being sent to the front end. Now, that could be an easy thing to do, depending on what kind of data you're sending down. All right, another totally real chat here. And I'll let the animation play through. Of course, we always start with a small talk, right? OK, here's why I'm really messaging you. And I'll freeze frame here. Cool. So date added, right? The engineer knows that that is part of a table. It's a column in a table that's already being joined. It's not going to be a big deal, right? So it's a pretty short estimate. So here's that task list in the engineer's mind. They might think that they just need to add it to the JSON API response. It's not going to be a huge latency hit. No big deal. Ship it, done. Whether you're using GraphQL, whether you're using a resource-based architecture or more traditional architecture, not a big difference here from the point of view of the product manager. But sometimes the conversation goes like this. Again, how's it going? OK. And now this is a more difficult one. First, listened to add. And that's got the spider senses tingling a little bit here. And then the estimate comes in, and the emoji comes, and that's rough. We've all had to be the bearer of this bad news. Something looks simple, but it really isn't, right? And we kind of actually end up like going like this in our mind, like it's just one more field, right? But in the engineer's mind, that's coming from a service. First of all, it's user dependent, right? And there's all sorts of latency concerns with that. And you have to guard everything, right? And you have to set up your observability. And that leads to stress. And it's not just stress for us, it's stress for the PM, because all of a sudden they had this great idea, and now they have to go up to their boss and tell them why that's going to be coming in 2 months instead of what they originally might have thought. We don't want that stress, but I'd like to go ahead and blow that out a little bit into a task list again. We don't want that costly field, first listened to at, to be included everywhere a song object is serialized, right? So we have to include it only behind a query param. Remember, this is in an alternate universe where we're not using GraphQL here. And that needs to be unit tested, right? Everything here just ends up adding complexity. You have to make a change in your back end, to make a change in your front end, and there's all this conditional logic that you want to do. That complexity slows down experimentation. Now, here in bold and italics are areas where GraphQL can reduce the work that we need in order to run experiments more efficiently. Reduces the amount of places you need to make changes in order to accommodate A/B tests and other changes too. And that allows you to free up your resources, right? So I'll do a quick demo here of like that motion. I know that this is, it's going to be pretty quick, but anyway, here we go. So to encapsulate this experiment, I'll go to, let's see, playlist, table. And before actually I go ahead and go into the code, I'm going to actually go into the user interface here and look at our dev tools. So here in this playlist, GraphQL Conf 2023. Can folks see, should I zoom in here? Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go down to the Apollo client cache here and find the playlist that I'm looking for, which has an ID of starting with 0, I think. 0BG, there it is. So now I know that so as I said before, there's no data coming in about first listen to add right now. We need to add it. So if I go into the source code here and add it to our edges, so we do first listened to add. This is an experiment too, so the logic for that experiment can actually be encoded into the query document. So I'll use the built-in @include directive in GraphQL, and I'll just stipulate a variable experiment on. All right, super, that was easy. And now I just need to update the query document as well. It was in the fragment, now it's the query document. Playlist, I can spell. Experiment on, and this is a Boolean that's non-nullable. We'll set a default value there, and then there's only one more change we need to make, which is actually the only line of TypeScript we need to change here, which is experiment on, and normally you just use your A/B test framework, whatever you're using, your feature flagging system, but I'll just hard code a Boolean true for simplicity's sake. We'll run our code gen here and get our types, and hopefully, if the demo deities are nice to me, that will come through. So I'll inspect the cache again, scroll on down, and I'm sure there's a faster way to scroll on down. I'm going to have to pick some brains later on, but here we are. In our tracks list, in our edges, we should be getting now that into the UI. Now, I'm not going to also spend time front-end coding here as much as I would like to. We do need to keep on moving. But notice like how most of the logic in there was encoded into your GraphQL document. That's powerful. GraphQL isn't just for one platform. It's for every platform, right? You're not just necessarily making a web app. If you're a product team, you might be shipping mobile apps too. So another sometimes overlooked benefit is that your experiment can be run in a similar fashion across all platforms without compromising on the design of your API or your various apps. That's a big deal. That's something that speaks to product managers a lot. So now in this universe, when we're using GraphQL, the product manager doesn't need to get that big old estimate anymore. It could be a much more manageable one. The team thrives. And I'll freeze frame there, just in case. Okay. Back to this slide. The takeaway here for the product manager is you don't want your data shape to be tightly coupled with the structure of your views or your platforms. It makes experimentation and innovation more costly and fragmented. While we're on the subject too, @deprecated is a great tool in the toolbox for GraphQL, right? If you're running a lot of experiments, you're going to deal with a lot of data that you don't need anymore. @deprecated is just a first-class support, right? You can just add it in, and it's a great signal to know what data is being used and what's going to be cleaned up pretty soon. So again, this is broadly applicable to any member of the cross-functional team, but I found that this sort of angle appeals to folks like product managers or maybe scrum masters, project managers, what have you. It goes back around to the point that GraphQL is not just a pile of features. It's a way to change how your team operates for the better. It's those superpowers that happen to your product manager when you adopt it. All right, I'm going to change gears a little bit. If you'll indulge me, I'd like to share another personal anecdote. That's me at the Last Drop coffee shop playing a game of chess with my kid, Mika, whom I mentioned earlier. She's 5 now. And I want to show you a game that we played, or rather an idealized version of the game we played. It's my talk. I get to make up the rules. You don't know whether this happened or not. But I was playing with the white pieces here. She was playing with the black pieces. I kind of enjoyed that giant chess set that they had out yesterday, too. I don't know if that's today or not, but might have to play a game later. But anyway, Mika made a great move here, moving her pawn forward 2 spaces, attacking both my knight and bishop at the same time, right? That's called a fork. It's a nice tactical advantage for her. The only problem here, and maybe some chess players in the audience see it, there's this arcane rule in chess, this edge case, if you will. Since you don't see it that often, it is definitely one of these edge cases. In this scenario, I could legally make this move and actually capture her attacking pawn. This move is called en passant. Mika did not know about this move. She's 5. I never told her. In my defense, she never asked. I didn't actually take the piece, though. I'm not a monster. The lesson learned, though, is that you can't make the best moves if you don't know all the rules of the game, right? Unlikely scenarios can cause bad outcomes. And keep that story in mind as we switch gears and talk about redesigns. Has anybody here, show of hands, implemented a redesign of an existing view, right? Anybody redesigned? Yeah? They're like cosmetic redesigns, right? Maybe a reskin, you're adding new colors or brand elements, but not really touching much else. But in my experience, a lot of redesigns involve changing the information architecture, adding, removing, adding things on the screen, right? And nothing is sacred in a redesign, basically. Many times, the entire interface is rethought from first principles. And it's also true that in a changing team or a recently reorganized team, it's like 2023, right? Whatever the scenario may be, it's frequently the case that the redesign is being done by someone who didn't have a hand in the original design or even in the most recent iteration. Design is cognitively demanding, right? It requires long periods of focus time, not unlike software engineering. In order to properly iterate, designers need to know what's available to display to the user and what a user can change. And I want to double underline the last bullet point here. Asking questions is costly. And this is especially true on a distributed team, especially when there's time zone asymmetry. So this is an unfortunately frequent scenario. Another real text message. That might feel familiar. This leads to stress. The design review is tomorrow. It needs to go well. I need answers, and I'm blocked until I get them. If your engineers are in the critical path in this manner, that's a risk for the team, right? The designer just needs to know, do all playlists have images? And if you don't know off the top of your head, and if you're otherwise busy, that's it. This is the sad truth. We often are the bottleneck for conveying what data is available and the meaning of that data to our teammates. The newer the designer to the team, the product or the feature, the more precarious the situation is. Focus is important. Having to stop and ask for vital information will interrupt both asker and answerer. That creates a dynamic that discourages question asking and therefore the flow of information. And even if questions do get asked, right, the fact remains is you don't know what you don't know. How would Mika have known to ask about en passant, for example, that move that you saw? That move does not happen often. And so people will plug those holes how they can, right? They will make assumptions based on how they click through your app, right? They're going to self-serve no matter what. And I've seen design reviews go very poorly because the design included an assumption that the system couldn't support. That makes the design process slower, right, and prone to human error. And as a manager, it's just sad to imagine how much creative time is squandered on a task that should really be self-service and on demand. Now, to be clear, this is a solvable problem, right? Teams have found strategies that work for them. OpenAPI, aka Swagger, is a great solution for any JSON API. It comes with a front end, a GUI that you can point your team to. Any number of ad hoc solutions can work too, an internal wiki, for example. But they share the same limitation. They're stapled onto your API after the fact, and that means they are fragile. They're brittle. Because when your annotations, your docs, your descriptions are separable from your API, they can be deprioritized, along with all the other things that you mean well to do, right? Add it to the Jira pile. I'm sure this room already knows how powerful GraphQL introspection can be to address this issue. And I'll quote from the spec here. I'm not going to read this all out loud, but documentation is a first-class feature of GraphQL, right? You'll never ship a description that's not in the code. You never ship code that's not described, at least in some way, at least with a type annotation, right? And that's a big deal. And you can even see, like, from the developer's point of view, in this Ruby code snippet, this is from GraphQL Ruby, how ergonomic the documentation can be for the developer. And writing a linter rule here is trivial. There's plenty of community linter rules for things like this in various different languages, right? And it even supports markdowns. Awesome. The point is GraphQL and its tooling are designed with ground-up support for this sort of thing, right? And there are great tools out there for exploring GraphQL schema. Graphical, for example, is one of them. And I'll show you kind of how this looks and how this can make an impact if, let's say, the designer had access to a GraphQL IDE, for example. So in that world where the designer needs to know, what's in a playlist, if they're just typing playlist into a GraphQL IDE, they can see it right here and find the images field. And I'll zoom in here if I'm allowed to, there we go. The description's right there, right? They can self-serve that. And not only does it tell you about whether or not every playlist has an image, which it looks like it can be empty, but it can contain up to 3 images. Well, that's interesting. Now I have a higher quality question to ask, right? So it's just another way that you can unlock the creative process through this. Cool. Whether it's Apollo Explorer, Graphical, or one of the other great tools out there, give it to your designers if they don't already have access to it. It will reduce interruptions. It will preserve focus, and it will result in higher quality conversations and designs. Now, it's not a perfect system, right? Things can still fall through the cracks if an engineer neglects to update a description, but you'll never document an unavailable field or have out-of-date docs that reference a field that was subsequently removed because it's inseparable from your SDL. Do I have time? I think I do. Okay, for the Figma stands in the house, there's a neat little plugin too that enables designers to pipe live data in Figma. Many designers are always looking for new sources of realistic looking data, and what's better than actually piping real data into your designs? So I'll go ahead and show this neat little plugin that I found called GraphQL Data Fill. And this is a Figma demo, which is a little far from my wheelhouse, so bear with me. But here, if you use GraphQL Data Fill, you can go ahead and pull up a graphical instance here. And just for simplicity's sake, I picked an unauthenticated API. So this is actually an API returning React conferences. So I'm going to go ahead and make a query against it. I'm going to find a conference with the ID of, sorry, I can't really see the contrast here, so I apologize. React Finland 2018. I have a colleague in Finland. So I picked React Finland, and we'll get the name back, right? So you can go ahead and query it, and it'll give it you back here. And you can actually pipe this in when you use some simple template syntax. I'm trying to zoom in, and now I'm zooming in the view instead of here. So I apologize if this is not super clear, but I'm just doing like a handlebar syntax here, and then conference.name. And now if I run the data fill plugin, and pipe that data in, it should automatically populate into my, oh, I have to rewrite it. Apologies, conference. And if I generate it, it'll pipe it in. Now we have a song named React Finland 2018 in here. So just wanted to share that. It's another potential tool that a designer might be interested in using. And I just think it's neat. Just wanted to share that. Again, broadly true for anyone who wants to know what data your UI has access to. And hopefully that's a lot of people. You don't want people learning the rules of the game while they're playing for real. GraphQL offers the best default experience for writing self-documenting, up-to-date APIs. Here's a picture of my cross-functional team at home. I'm mostly including this because I don't want the rest of my kids to feel left out, and it also gives me a way to smoothly transition into the conclusion. In conclusion, GraphQL is not just a tool for engineers. It offers concrete operational benefits for designers and product managers. It elevates the team through facilitating higher quality designs. It can reduce your experiment cycle time so they can be measured in weeks and not months. By adopting GraphQL, you're giving your cross-functional teammates superpowers. I will admit that the examples shared today were basic, but it is the basics of the language that make it so impactful for ourselves and our colleagues. Again, I'm really eager for your feedback on this talk, so please come and find me. Give me a shout on social media, whatever it is. Tell me what resonated with you, what worked, or what didn't work. I'd like to acknowledge the folks. Gerald Miller, thank you for making the Spotify Showcase app. It is paid off so many times. Shout out to some other contributors, including Alessia Belisario, whom you heard from yesterday, amazing talk, as well as Michael Watson, who's in the crowd here, Dylan Anthony, and Jeremy Lempereur. Gerard Lemuse made the GraphQL data fill plugin you saw. And if you like those little message animations, check out fakemessenger.com. But they were real, of course. And of course, the folks at the GraphQL Foundation for making this conference happen. I'm all having a great time, and the great speakers you've seen so far, and we'll see for the rest of the day. I'm so privileged and humbled to be able to share this stage with you. Thank you so much.